The $500,000 chandelier above us could not outshine Victoria's triumphant smirk as she projected grainy photos of me with a stranger. She announced my infidelity to the entire party, expecting me to beg for forgiveness. Instead, I threw my head back and laughed until the crystal in her hand shook. She had no idea the man in the pictures was not my lover, but the eviction notice for her entire dynasty. My name is Serena Graymont, to the industrial titans and tech moguls who pay my retainer. I am a 34-year-old weapon in a tailored suit, a senior crisis manager at Aegis Solutions who can make a corporate scandal vanish from the headlines in under 48 hours. I am the woman you call when the ship is sinking and the rats are already swimming for shore. I orchestrate public perception. I manipulate the truth until it looks palatable. I am feared, respected, and highly compensated. But here, standing in the shadow of the colossal limestone portico of the Thorne estate in the Hamptons, I am none of those things. To the people inside these walls, I am merely a biological accessory. I am the breathing, walking mannequin arm candy for the heir apparent. I am the mistake that Julian made 5 years ago. A mistake they are too polite to erase in public but eager to torment in private. The air here always smelled different than the rest of New York. It did not smell of exhaust or ambition. It smelled of manicured boxwood, Atlantic brine, and the kind of stale, suffocating money that had not been earned in 3 generations. Today was the day before the main event. Tomorrow, Julian will turn 40. 40 years of existing, consuming, and coasting on the interest of a fortune built by a grandfather he barely remembered. I stood in the center of the Grand Salon, a room so large it had its own weather system, watching an army of caterers move with the synchronized terror of soldiers under fire. They were setting up for the pre-party brunch, a casual affair for 50 of the closest friends, which in Thorne speak meant 50 people who hated each other but shared the same investment bankers. Victoria Thorne stood by the French doors, bathed in the morning light that seemed to bend around her rather than touch her. She was 62 but looked a frozen. Ageless 50 thanks to a team of Swiss surgeons. She was pointing a manicured finger at a young florist who looked on the verge of tears. "No," Victoria said. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, which made it infinitely more terrifying than a scream. I said cerulean blue for the accent ribbons, not sky blue. Sky blue is for baby showers and people who shop at malls. Cerulean is for sophistication. Do I need to explain the color wheel to you? Or can you manage to fix this before I have you escorted off the property?" The girl stammered, clutching a bundle of hydrangeas. I will fix it, Mrs. Thorne, immediately." I stepped forward, my heels clicking sharply on the marble floors. The sound was the only thing I could contribute to the conversation. "Victoria," I said, keeping my voice even. "The ribbons look fine. The lighting in the evening will darken the shade anyway. If we change them now, the florists will fall behind on the centerpieces for the main hall." Victoria turned to me slowly. Her eyes were the color of ice that had been kept in a freezer for a decade. She looked me up and down, lingering on my dress, a simple, elegant sheath that cost more than my father's car. Yet on me, she made it look like a rag. "Serena," she said, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How quaint of you to have an opinion. But please, darling, don't tax your pretty little head with logistics. You are here to look radiant and keep Julian's glass full. Leave the thinking to the adults who understand the nuance of presentation. This isn't one of your little office parties." My jaw tightened. My little office parties involved managing press conferences for oil spills and senatorial sex scandals. I managed logistics that could topple governments. But I swallowed the retort. That was the rule here. Silence was the currency of admission. "I just don't want the schedule to slip," I said, forcing a neutral tone. "Julian gets anxious when things run late." "Julian is my son," Victoria snapped, turning back to the terrified florist. "I know what makes him anxious, and right now, it is having a wife who hovers like a nervous waitress. Go find him. He is by the pool. Make sure he is wearing the linen shirt I laid out, not that dreadful polo he likes." I was dismissed, just like the florist. I turned and walked away. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. It was always like this. 1,000 tiny cuts, 1,000 reminders that I was the daughter of a school teacher and a mechanic, that I had worked my way through college, that I had grit under my fingernails that no amount of manicures could hide from her X-ray vision. I found Julian on the terrace overlooking the ocean. He was lounging on a teak sunbed, wearing exactly what his mother had forbidden the polo shirt. He looked magnificent. I had to give him that. At nearly 40, he had the golden sun-kissed look of a man who had never experienced a day of stress in his life. His dark hair was perfectly tousled by the sea breeze. He held a tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, the ice clinking softly as he swirled it. "You're drinking scotch at 11 in the morning?" I asked, approaching him. Julian looked up, squinting against the sun. A lazy smile spread across his face. It was the smile that had charmed me 5 years ago. The smile that said, "I am lost, save me, now." It just looked practiced. "It's a celebration week, Serena," he drawled. "40th birthday only happens once. Besides, Mother is tearing the staff apart inside. I needed to fortify my nerves." "She's changing the ribbons," I said, sitting on the edge of the adjacent lounge. "She told me I didn't understand the nuance of the presentation." Julian laughed, a hollow sound. "Well, she is a perfectionist. You know how she gets. Just let her have her way. Serena, it is easier than fighting." "It's your birthday, Julian," I said, watching the waves crash against the private beach below. "Not hers. I thought maybe you would want to have a say in the guest list at least. I saw the final draft this morning. She cut the few friends you actually like from college and replaced them with Senator Miller's entourage." Julian took a long sip of his drink. He didn't look at me. He looked at the horizon, his eyes empty. "The senator is important for the family foundation. Serena, you know that. Mother is just thinking about the future. I don't mind, as long as the champagne is cold. Who cares who drinks it?" He didn't care. That was the tragedy of Julian Thorne. He was a beautiful, hollow vessel. He had no ambition, no spine, no drive. He was content to be a child in a man's body, fed and watered by the trust fund, protected by the iron wall his mother had built around him, and I was the intruder who kept trying to make him stand up. "I care," I whispered. "I care that you're happy." He reached out and patted my hand, a gesture so patronizing it made my skin crawl. "I am happy, babe. Look at this view. What is there to be unhappy about now? Be a dear and tell the staff to bring me a refill. This ice is melting." I pulled my hand away and stood up. "I'll tell them." I walked back toward the house, feeling the familiar weight of isolation settling in my chest. As I passed the outdoor bar, I saw a group of guests who had arrived early for the weekend. It was the Vanderbilts and the Carringtons' names that appeared on library wings and hospital buildings. They were clustered together, sipping mimosas. As I approached, the conversation died instantly. They turned to look at me. Their eyes were like scanners at a checkout counter, reading the price tag of my soul. "Serena," piped up Clarissa Vanderbilt, a woman who had never worked a day in her life. "We were just talking about you. Julian tells us you're still working, even with the big 4-0 bash coming up." The way she said working sounded like she was accusing me of having a contagious disease. "Yes," I said, flashing my corporate smile, the one I used before firing a negligent executive. "Crisis management doesn't adhere to a social calendar. Clarissa, problems happen 24 hours a day." "Oh, how dreadful," she tittered, exchanging a look with the others. "I suppose it keeps you busy, though I do wonder why you bother. Julian certainly provides enough, doesn't he? It almost looks like, well, like you don't trust the family to take care of you." "It's about fulfillment," I said, my voice hardening. "Something beyond shopping." The silence that followed was sharp. I had crossed a line. I was the help who had spoken out of turn. "Well," Clarissa said, turning her back to me, "I suppose some people are just built for labor. It is in the blood, isn't it?" I walked away before I said something that would end up in the tabloids. My blood was boiling. Built for labor. That was their code. That was their way of calling me trash. I needed to breathe. I headed for the side entrance, aiming for the relative sanctuary of the library, but my path was blocked by a large easel displaying the seating chart for the formal dinner tomorrow night. It was an ornate display, calligraphy on heavy cream cardstock, framed in gold. I stopped to scan it, looking for the head table. Julian was there. Of course. Victoria was seated to his right, the position of honor. To his left should have been me, the wife. I scanned the names: Julian, Victoria, Senator Miller, Lady Ashford, the CEO of Holden Enterprises. My name was not there. I frowned and scanned the other tables. Table 2, Table 3. Finally, I found it. Serena Graymont Thorne. I was at Table 9. Table 9 was by the kitchen doors. It was the table for the distant cousins, the overflow guests, and the staff's plus ones. I was being placed in Siberia at my own husband's 40th birthday party. I stared at the calligraphy until the letters blurred. This wasn't an oversight. Victoria didn't make mistakes. This was a declaration of war. It was a public statement that I was no longer part of the inner circle. I was being phased out. My pocket vibrated against my thigh. It was the distinctive double buzz of my work phone, the encrypted line. I looked around. Victoria had strictly forbidden business devices in the common areas. "We are not stockbrokers," she had sniffed. "We do not check screens in the company." I hurried down the hallway, ducking into the powder room beneath the main staircase. It was a lavish space, lined with black marble and gold fixtures, smelling of expensive soap. I locked the heavy mahogany door and leaned against it, exhaling a breath I didn't know I was holding. I pulled out the phone. It was Marcus, my second-in-command at Aegis. "Talk to me," I said, answering the call. My voice shifted instantly. The trembling wife was gone. The crisis manager was present. "Serena, we have a code red," Marcus said, his voice tight. "The CEO of Omnicorp was caught on a hot mic making derogatory comments about the unions during the merger talks. The audio just leaked to Twitter. Stock is down 6% in 10 minutes. "Okay," I said, my mind racing, analyzing the variables. "First, get the legal team to issue a statement claiming the audio is taken out of context. Even if it isn't, it buys us time. Second, I want a deep dive on the union leader's past. Find me leverage. We don't use it. We just hold it. Third, get the CEO to donate $1 million to a workers' relief fund within the hour. Do not ask him. Tell him. If he refuses, tell him the board is already drafting his resignation letter." "Got it," Marcus said. "You're a lifesaver. I know you're at the big party. I'm sorry to bother you." "Don't be," I said. Looking at myself in the mirror, the woman staring back was fierce, capable, and powerful. She wasn't the woman being seated at table 9. "This is the only thing keeping me sane. Marcus, execute the plan. Call me if the stock drops another 2 points." I hung up. For a moment, I just stood there, gripping the phone. In my world, I commanded millions of dollars and saved reputations. In this house, I had to hide in a toilet to do my job. The absurdity of it made me want to scream. I flushed the toilet, just in case anyone was listening outside, and washed my hands. I composed my face, putting the mask of the dutiful wife back on. I unlocked the door and stepped out. The hallway was empty, or so I thought. The door to the main study, Julian's grandfather's library, was slightly ajar. I heard voices drifting out. The heavy oak door muffled the sound, but the acoustics of the hallway carried certain frequencies perfectly. I recognized the voices instantly. One was Victoria. The other was Arthur Pym, the family's longtime attorney and fixer, a man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he had dug the graves. I shouldn't have stopped. I should have kept walking, but my name hung in the air like smoke. "Prenuptials are ironclad. Victoria," Arthur was saying. His voice was dry, like rustling paper. "But it requires cause. Infidelity is the cleanest trigger. If we initiate a no-fault divorce, she gets a settlement, a significant one, given the duration of the marriage. 5 years puts her in the tier for alimony. I froze. My blood turned to ice. I pressed myself against the wall, just out of sight of the door crack. I am not paying that shop girl a single dime of Thorn money, Victoria hissed. Her voice was venomous, stripped of all the fake sweetness she used in public. She has leeched off Julian long enough. She walks around here like she owns the place, with her cheap ambition and her common accent. We need proof, Victoria, Arthur cautioned. Serena is smart. She works in crisis management. She knows how to cover tracks. If we manufacture evidence and she catches us, it could blow back on the estate. She won't catch us, Victoria said confidently. She is distracted. She thinks she is part of the family. She is soft. And besides, I have already set the wheels in motion. The birthday is the deadline. Are you sure? Arthur asked. Julian seems hesitant. Julian does what I tell him to do, Victoria snapped. He knows the situation. He knows we need to trim the fat. Serena is an expense we can no longer afford. She has a tumor. Arthur, and what do we do with tumors? There was a pause. I could hear the clinking of china. We cut them out, Arthur said. Exactly, Victoria replied. After the candles are blown out tomorrow night, after the speeches are made, we operate. I want the papers ready to be served the moment the party ends. I want her out of this house before the hangover sets in. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard, I thought they would hear it. A tumor. They were planning to ambush me. They were planning to discard me like a used napkin the moment the party was over. I didn't stay to hear the rest. I turned and walked silently back down the hall. My steps light on the thick Persian runner. I didn't go back to the pool. I didn't go to the salon. I walked out the side door, into the cold Atlantic wind. The tears I expected didn't come. The panic I should have felt was absent. Instead, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. It was the same feeling I got when a client called me at 3 a.m. with a disaster. The emotional center of my brain shut down, and the tactical center lit up. They thought I was soft. They thought I was distracted. They thought I was a doll. I reached into my pocket and touched my phone. I wasn't just a wife. I was Serena Graymont. I destroyed enemies for a living. If they wanted to cut out the tumor, they were about to discover that the tumor was the only thing holding their rotting body together. And if I was going down, I was going to take the entire Thorn dynasty down with me. The wind off the Atlantic whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. But I welcomed the pain. It was sharp. It was real. It grounded me. As I stood on the cliffs overlooking the churning gray water, the conversation I had just overheard in the library replayed in my mind not as a tragedy, but as a data set, a tumor. They called me a tumor. In my line of work, you do not cry over spilt milk. You analyze why the glass tipped over. I needed to understand how I had let myself become a liability in my own life. I needed to conduct a post-mortem on my marriage before I could sign the death certificate. I closed my eyes and let the timeline reconstruct itself. It started 5 years ago. Not with flowers or a dinner date, but with a panic attack in a holding cell. I had been called in by a frantic junior partner at Aegis to handle a sensitive situation involving the son of a high-profile client. That was the first time I saw Julian. He was sitting on a metal bench in the precinct, his tuxedo jacket torn at the shoulder, his head in his hands. He looked like a fallen angel, utterly defeated by the grim reality of fluorescent lights and police coffee. He had crashed his vintage Porsche into a fire hydrant in the West Village. No one was hurt, but his blood alcohol level was borderline, and the press was sniffing around. When I walked in, he looked up at me with eyes that were so wide, so terrified, and so desperately pleading that they bypassed my professional firewall entirely. I was used to dealing with arrogance. I was used to CEOs screaming that they were above the law. Julian was different. He was soft. He was apologetic. He trembled when he asked if his mother would find out. I will handle it, I had told him, my voice firm. You just need to follow my lead. And he did. He followed me like a lost duckling. I made the story go away. I framed it as a mechanical failure combined with exhaustion from charity work. I spun the narrative so well that the papers printed a story about his dedication to philanthropy instead of his drinking. In the weeks that followed, Julian did not send me a check. He sent me handwritten letters on thick cream stationery. He sent me rare orchids. He showed up at my office with coffee because he worried I was working too hard. I fell in love with his helplessness. That is the ugly truth I have to admit to myself now. After spending 12 hours a day fighting with sharks in boardrooms, coming home to a man who looked at me as if I hung the moon and the stars was intoxicating. I wanted to be needed. I wanted to be the strong one. Julian allowed me to be the protector, a role I had played my entire life for my parents, for my siblings, and for my clients. He made me feel powerful by being weak. I mistook his lack of spine for gentleness. I mistook his dependency for devotion. The warning signs were there, flashing in neon red, but I was wearing rose-colored glasses. The biggest red flag came 3 months before the wedding. We were sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of Arthur Pym, the same lawyer I had just heard plotting my demise. Arthur had slid a document across the desk. It was thick, bound in leather, and titled Pre-Nuptial Agreement. "Standard procedure, my dear," Victoria had said from the corner, sipping her tea. "Protecting the legacy." I read it. It was not standard. It was draconian. It stipulated that in the event of a divorce, I would receive a tiered settlement based on years of marriage. But there was a clause 4B, that was bolded and underlined, the infidelity clause. If I were found to be unfaithful, the marriage would be dissolved immediately, and I would leave with absolutely nothing, no alimony, no division of assets, not even the gifts I had been given during the marriage. At the time, I looked at Julian. He was studying his fingernails, refusing to meet my eyes. "Do you think I'm after your money?" I had asked, feeling a surge of prideful anger. "I make my own money, Victoria. I make more in a year than Julian has made in his life." "Then you should have no problem signing it," Victoria had countered smoothly. "If you are faithful, you have nothing to fear, unless, of course, you plan on straying." I signed it with a flourish, pressing the pen down so hard it nearly tore the paper. I signed it to prove them wrong. I signed it because I was arrogant enough to believe that my love for Julian was immutable, and that his love for me was safe. Now, 5 years later, that signature was the weapon they were loading to shoot me in the head. The wind bit through my thin silk blouse, bringing me back to the present. The coldness of the Hamptons air was nothing compared to the frost that had settled between Julian and me over the last 6 months. It hadn't been a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. Julian stopped looking at me like I was his savior and started looking at me like I was his jailer. The physical intimacy evaporated first. He claimed he was tired. He claimed he was stressed about new ventures. That was the joke of the century. Julian Thorne had never ventured anything in his life except a bet on a horse. Then came the absences. "I have a meeting with investors in the city," he would say, avoiding my gaze as he tied his tie in the mirror. "Do not wait up." I was a crisis manager. My entire career was built on pattern recognition. I noticed the patterns immediately. His investor meetings always happened on Thursday nights. He always came home smelling of a shower. Not the city soap that was too floral, shampoo that wasn't ours. I did not scream. I did not throw vases. I did what I do best. I audited him. I logged into the American Express portal for his supplementary card. He thought he was clever. He thought because the bill went to the family accountant. I wouldn't see it, but I had the passwords. I had always handled the mundane administrative tasks because Julian found them boring. The statements were a map of his betrayal. The St. Regis room service for 2 at midnight. The Nomad Hotel. A spa charge at the Mandarin Oriental on a Tuesday afternoon when he was supposed to be at a golf tournament. The numbers were staggering. $3,000 for a weekend stay. $800 for a dinner at Le Bernardin. He was living a bachelor's fantasy on credit, and he wasn't doing it alone. But it wasn't just the money. It was the clumsiness of it. He didn't even try to hide it well. It was as if he wanted to be caught. Or perhaps He simply didn't respect me enough to cover his tracks. He knew I was busy saving other people's reputations, so he assumed I was too distracted to notice he was rotting. And then there was Victoria. If Julian was the knife, his mother was the hand that twisted it. Her hatred for me had evolved from subtle snobbery to active warfare. She couldn't stand that I worked. She couldn't stand that I didn't need their money. She couldn't stand that I was new money, earned with sweat rather than inherited with blood. The incident with the dress last year was the moment I realized this was not just a difficult mother-in-law relationship, it was a blood sport. It was the Met Gala season. Victoria had summoned me to her room, holding a garment bag with a look of benevolence that should have terrified me. "I found this in the archives," she had said, her voice dripping with fake honey. "It is a vintage Dior. Julian's grandmother wore it to the embassy ball in 1960. I thought it would be a lovely gesture for you to wear it to the Foundation Charity Gala, a way to show you are truly part of the history." I was touched. I was foolishly, naively touched. The dress was beautiful, a pale lavender chiffon. I wore it with pride. I walked the red carpet on Julian's arm, feeling like I had finally been accepted. Then, halfway through the cocktail hour, the editor of Vogue stopped me. She didn't look impressed. She looked pious. "Oh, honey," she whispered, leaning in close. "You are brave." "Excuse me," I had asked. "To wear a replica," she said. "And not a very good one. Is this polyester blend? I think I saw this exact design at a costume shop in the East Village last Halloween." My face had burned with the heat of 1,000 suns. I looked across the room and saw Victoria. She was sipping champagne, watching me. She raised her glass in a silent toast, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. She had sent me out in a costume to be humiliated by the fashion elite of New York. She wanted to remind everyone that no matter what I wore, I was just a pretender. I was a fake, just like the dress. I never told Julian. What was the point? He would have said I was being sensitive. He would have said his mother meant well and probably made a mistake. He always defended her. He was still the scared boy in the police station, only now he was hiding behind his mother's skirt instead of mine. But the final straw, the piece of data that turned my sorrow into cold, hard rage, had landed on my desk only yesterday. I had been reviewing the liquidity of our joint emergency fund. This was money I had contributed to significantly. A safety net for the house, for future children, for disasters. The balance was down by $50,000. I clicked on the transaction history, a wire transfer, dated 2 days ago. The recipient was Van Cleef and Arpels. $50,000. My hand had gone to my throat involuntarily. I had never received a gift from Julian worth more than a few $1,000s, and usually, those were chosen by his personal shopper. $50,000 was a statement piece. It was a diamond choker or a rare sapphire pendant. I had rushed home early that day, thinking, hoping, that perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps this was a surprise for me. Perhaps he was trying to fix things. Maybe this was an early birthday gift for himself that he wanted me to wear. I checked the safe in his dressing room. I knew the combination. It was his birthday. Inside, tucked behind a stack of cash, was the velvet box. I opened it. It was a diamond tennis necklace, exquisite and delicate, platinum setting, flawless stones. It glittered in the dim light of the closet. I felt a brief flicker of hope. Maybe he did love me. Maybe this was for tomorrow night. Then I saw the card tucked underneath the box. It was not my name on the envelope. It was not to my wife. The card was blank, but the receipt was still inside the bag, and on the bottom of the receipt, in the notes section for delivery instructions, it read, "Happy 23rd. C. You are the only light in this gloomy house. C. My name starts with S. I am 34, not 23. I snapped the box shut. He had taken $50,000 of our joint money that I had largely earned while he played golf to buy a diamond necklace for a 23-year-old girl while his mother plotted to kick me out on the street with nothing. I stood there in the closet, holding the proof of his betrayal, and I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't a loud snap. It was the quiet, structural failure of a bridge that has borne too much weight for too long. They wanted to play games, fine. I invented games. They wanted to use the law. I knew the law better than they did. They wanted to talk about finances. I was about to give them a masterclass in forensic accounting. I put the box back exactly where I found it. I locked the safe. I walked out of the closet and back to the cliffs where I stood now. Julian thought he was the main character of this story. Victoria thought she was the director. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. They had hired a crisis manager to be a wife. And a crisis manager knows that when the building is burning, you don't run. You control the burn. You decide what gets saved and what turns to ash. I looked down at the dark water crashing against the rocks. "Happy birthday, Julian," I whispered to the wind. "I hope you enjoy your party, because it is going to be the most expensive night of your life." I turned my back on the ocean and walked toward the house. It was time to get to work. I had a phone call to make and a role to play. The grieving, oblivious wife had to make one final appearance before the executioner took the stage. To understand how I orchestrated the destruction of the Thorne dynasty, you must first understand that I did not start this journey seeking revenge. I started seeking insurance. 2 weeks before the party, before the ribbon disputes and the seating chart humiliations, I sat in the austere silence of my home office with a singular goal risk assessment. In my profession, we do not hope for the best. We calculate the worst-case scenario and build a bunker, with Julian's behavior becoming increasingly erratic and the whispers about the family's liquidity issues circulating in the high-stakes circles I moved in. I needed to know if my husband was simply having a midlife crisis or if the ship was actually taking on water. I told myself I was doing it for us. If there was financial trouble, I could fix it. I had the skills, the connections, and the personal capital to restructure their debt. I was ready to be the dutiful wife who saved the day. I was such a fool. It began on a Tuesday night. Julian was asleep, passing out early after exhausting negotiations that I now knew were trysts in boutique hotels. I logged into the Thorne family office server. It was embarrassingly easy. For a family so obsessed with privacy, their cybersecurity was medieval. The password for the main administrative account was Victoria's birthday followed by her initials. I expected to find mismanagement. I expected to find overspending. What I found was a corpse that had been rotting for years, painted over with gold leaf. The Thorne fortune was a myth. I stared at the spreadsheets, my eyes scanning columns of red ink that stretched back a decade. The operating capital was non-existent. The trust funds were drained. The lavish lifestyle, the galas, the vintage cars. The staff of 20 was being funded by a chaotic web of high-interest loans from predatory lenders and shell companies based in the Cayman Islands. They were robbing Peter to pay Paul, but Peter had been dead for 5 years. I dug deeper, following the digital paper trail. The most sickening discovery was the charitable foundation, the Thorne Hope Foundation. Dedicated to pediatric oncology, was the family's crown jewel. Victoria loved to weep on stage about the sick children, but the ledgers told a different story. Systematic withdrawals labeled as administrative consulting fees were being funneled directly into Victoria's personal accounts to pay for her couture, her plastic surgery, and the maintenance of this very estate. They were stealing from children with cancer to buy Hermes bags. I felt bile rise in my throat. This was not just irresponsibility. This was prison time. This was federal fraud. I needed air, so I walked out of my office and into the darkened hallway of the mansion. The house felt different now. It did not feel like a sanctuary of old money. It felt like a film set where the props were made of cardboard. I stopped in front of the Degas hanging in the east corridor. It was a small pastel of a dancer, valued at $4 million. Victoria had bragged about it endlessly. I turned on the flashlight of my phone and held it close to the canvas, risking the alarm. There was no texture. I touched the surface. It was smooth, too smooth. I hurried back to the computer and pulled up the auction house records. My fingers flew across the keyboard. There it was. The real Degas had been sold privately to a collector in Abu Dhabi 8 months ago. The listing price was $3.5 million. The money had been wired to an account in the Seychelles that was emptied within 48 hours. Every masterpiece in the house was likely a high-quality giclée print. They were living inside a counterfeit museum. My initial shock was rapidly cooling into a forensic detachment. If they were this desperate, what else were they hiding? I turned my attention to Julian's personal laptop, which he had carelessly left on the library desk. I did not need to hack it. His password was Julian T1. I bypassed his browser history. I already knew what filth I would find there and went straight to his local files. I searched for recent documents. One folder stood out, created 3 months ago. It was titled Project Liberty. I opened it, and the air left my lungs. It was not a business plan. It was a script, a detailed, step-by-step roadmap for divorcing me. Phase 1. Distancing. Establish emotional unavailability to provoke reactions. Phase 2. The setup. Hire a private investigator to document Serena's schedule. Phase 3. The bait. Plant evidence of infidelity. Phase 4. The reveal. Public humiliation at the birthday event to force a settlement under the duress of social ruin. Goal. Activate Clause 4(b) of the prenuptial agreement. Zero financial liability. They had written it down. They had actually typed out a plan to destroy my life as if they were planning a corporate merger. I scrolled down and found the correspondence with the private investigator. His name was Rick Slattery, a bottom feeder who operated out of a strip mall in Queens. There were invoices for surveillance services. There were photos of me having lunch with male clients, cropped and grainy to look intimate. There were notes from Victoria in the margins of the document, digital comments that read, "Make sure she looks drunk in these shots. And can we doctor the timestamps to match her late nights at the office?" They weren't just ending the marriage. They were manufacturing a reality where I was the villain. They wanted to strip me of my reputation, my dignity, and every cent I had earned, just to save themselves the cost of a divorce settlement. I sat back in the chair, the glow of the screen illuminating the tears that refused to fall. I was beyond sad. I was in the realm of absolute, crystalline fury. But the file contained one more document, a PDF labeled Outstanding Liabilities. I opened it. It was a summary of the debts that could not be reshuffled or ignored. At the top of the list, highlighted in red, was a name I had not seen before: Holden Enterprises. Holden Enterprises held the primary mortgage on the Hamptons estate. The note was massive, $15 million, and the Thorns were 6 months behind on payments. The document noted that Holden Enterprises had initiated pre-foreclosure proceedings. The house I was sitting in, the symbol of their power, was effectively already gone. They were squatters in a mansion that belonged to a creditor they couldn't pay. I memorized the name, Holden Enterprises. I closed the Project Liberty folder and decided to check one last thing. The email client was open. I searched for the name of Julian's biggest business partner, a man named Silas Sterling. Silas was a shark, a billionaire who controlled the construction contracts that were the only legitimate revenue stream the Thorne family had left. I found a thread, but it wasn't with Silas. It was with Elena Sterling, Silas's wife. The emails were graphic. They were explicit. They detailed encounters in the very hotels I had seen on the credit card statement. But worse than the sex was the stupidity. Julian bragged to her. "Don't worry about the old man." Julian wrote in an email dated 3 weeks ago, "Once I get rid of Serena and get my trust fund unlocked, we can stop hiding. Silas is a dinosaur. You deserve a king." My hand hovered over the mouse. This was the nuclear bomb. Silas Sterling was a man known for his ruthlessness. If he found out his business partner was sleeping with his wife and calling him a dinosaur, he wouldn't just sue Julian. He would bury him. He would destroy the family name so thoroughly that they wouldn't be able to get a library card, let alone a loan. Julian was sleeping with the wife of the one man keeping their financial heads above water. I had enough. I had everything. I could have woken Julian up right then. I could have dragged him out of bed, thrown the laptop at his head, and screamed until the windows shattered. I could have called Victoria and told her I knew about the fake art and the stolen charity money. I could have burned the house down. But that is what a victim does. That is what a battered wife does. I was Serena Graymont. I managed crises. And I realized, with a terrifying calm, that this was no longer a marriage to be saved. This was a hostile takeover to be won. I pulled a flash drive from my purse. I copied the Project Liberty folder. I copied the financial ledgers. I copied the emails with Elena Sterling. I copied the correspondence with the private investigator. Then I carefully wiped my fingerprints from the keyboard. I closed the laptop and placed it exactly where I had found it, angled slightly to the left, just as Julian had left it. I walked back to the master bedroom. Julian was snoring, his mouth open, looking soft and harmless. He had no idea that the woman slipping into the bed beside him was no longer his wife. I was his executioner. I stared at the ceiling as the first light of dawn began to turn the room gray. They wanted a show. They wanted a dramatic reveal at the birthday party. They wanted to ruin me in front of the elite. Okay, I thought, feeling a slow, cold smile spread across my face in the darkness. I will give you a show. I would not confront them. I would not hint that I knew. I would play the part of the clueless, anxious, devoted wife for 2 more weeks. I would let them think their trap was working. I would let Victoria gloat. I would let Julian lie to my face. And while they were busy setting the stage for my destruction, I would be rewriting the ending of their play. I closed my eyes and finally slept. It was the most peaceful sleep I had enjoyed in years. The uncertainty was gone. I knew exactly what I had to do. The timeline was set. The players were in position, and I had just found the name of the weapon I would use to sever their heads. Holden Enterprises. Tomorrow, I will find out who they were, and then I would make them mine. If you want to catch a predator, you do not build a cage, you build a nest. Fill it with warm, soft feathers, and lay down inside it. Pretending to be asleep, you wait for them to smell the vulnerability. You wait for their hunger to override their caution. For the next 10 days, I became the perfect prey. I knew exactly who Victoria had hired. Rick Slattery was a man who lacked imagination, which made him predictable. He drove a charcoal gray sedan that he parked exactly 3 car lengths behind my Range Rover whenever I left the estate. He thought he was invisible. To me, he was as conspicuous as a neon sign. I decided to give Rick a show worth billing for. I began to curate my movements with the precision of a ballet dancer. I stopped leaving the house at normal hours. Instead, I waited until 11 at night. I would slip out the side door, wearing a trench coat and oversized sunglasses, clutching my phone to my chest like it contained nuclear codes. I made sure to look over my shoulder constantly, offering his telephoto lens the perfect angle of a guilty, nervous wife. I drove to places that screamed illicit behavior. I parked in the back lots of seedy motels on the outskirts of Queens, sat there for 20 minutes with the engine running, and then drove away. I went to 24-hour diners and sat in the corner booth, whispering into my phone with animated, frantic hand gestures. "No, he doesn't suspect anything," I would say to the dial tone, ensuring my voice was loud enough for a parabolic microphone to catch, but soft enough to sound like a secret. "I just need a little more time. I can't leave him yet. The money isn't ready." I was feeding them exactly what they wanted to hear. I was validating their script. Humans have a fatal flaw called confirmation bias. Once they believe you are a villain, everything you do looks like a crime. If I bought coffee, I was buying it for a lover. If I checked my watch, I was counting down the minutes to a tryst. The effect on the household was immediate and gratifying. Victoria stopped snapping at me. In fact, she became almost giddy. The tension that had plagued the house for months dissolved into a strange, suffocating sweetness. She was like a cat that had cornered a mouse and was just taking a moment to clean its paws before the kill. At dinner 3 nights before the party, the atmosphere was electric with her anticipation. We were eating roasted quail tiny, fragile birds that crunched under the knife. "The house feels so heavy lately, doesn't it?" Victoria said, slicing through a wing. She didn't look at me. She looked at the empty chair where Julian's father used to sit. "I think it is time for a spiritual cleansing, a purging of the old energy to make way for the new." She raised her wine glass to the light, inspecting the rim. I agree, I said, pushing a piece of meat around my plate. Change is good. Oh, it is not just good. Serena, she said, her eyes finally locking onto mine. They glittered with malice. It is essential, you know. The gardeners are coming tomorrow to weed the rose beds. They have to pull the weeds out by the roots, or they just choke the beautiful blooms. It is brutal work, but necessary. You can't let parasites destroy the garden. I am sure the roses will appreciate it, I replied, keeping my voice trembling slightly. I took a sip of water to hide the smirk threatening to break through my facade. Keep talking. Victoria, dig the hole deeper. Julian certainly will, she added. He deserves to bloom. He has been overshadowed for too long. She was so confident. She had the photos. She had the audio logs from Rick. She thought she had the smoking gun. She didn't realize she was holding a stick of dynamite that I had lit from the other end. The next morning, I initiated the endgame. I used a burner phone to call Damon Vance. Damon was not a lover. He was not a friend. In the traditional sense, he was a ghost. We had met 7 years ago when I consulted on a hostile takeover defense for a tech firm in Silicon Valley. Damon was the man the government sent in when they couldn't figure out where the billions had gone. He was formerly with the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Division, and now he operated a private forensic accounting firm that terrified Wall Street. Serena. His voice rasped over the line. It has been a long time. You usually only call me when someone is about to go to prison. Someone is, I said. I need a favor. Damon, and I need you to wear your best suit. I am listening. I need you to meet me at the Obsidian Room in Manhattan tonight at 9. I need you to look like you want to sleep with me, and I need you to accept a very large file of documents while looking incredibly guilty about it. Damon laughed, a dry, sharp sound. Am I playing the other man? You are playing the executioner, I corrected. But they need to think you are the other man. Bring your team's findings on the shell companies I sent you last week. Print them out. Make the folder thick. The Holden Enterprises data, he asked. Serena, what I found in there? It is ugly. These people aren't just broke. They are laundering money for some very bad actors to cover their debts. I know, I said. Bring it all, tonight. The Obsidian Room was perfect. It was dark, lined with velvet and brass, and smelled of expensive scotch and bad decisions. It was the kind of place where affairs were not just tolerated. They were part of the decor. I arrived at 9 sharp. I wore a black dress with a slit up the thigh, something Julian would never let me wear, something that screamed seduction. I spotted Rick Slattery immediately. He was sitting at the bar, nursing a beer, trying to blend in behind a newspaper. It was almost insulting how bad he was at this. I walked to the booth in the back corner, the one I had reserved specifically because it had a direct line of sight from the bar, but was shadowed enough to look intimate. Damon was already there. He looked devastating. He was 45, with silver-streaked hair and the hard, predatory gaze of a wolf. He stood up when I approached and kissed me on both cheeks. You look dangerous, he murmured. That is the point, I whispered back. I sat down, leaning across the table so our faces were inches apart. Don't look at the bar. The camera is behind you. Damon smirked and slid a hand across the table to cover mine. To an observer, it was a romantic gesture. In reality, he was passing me a USB drive. The audit is complete, he said, his voice low. We traced the $50 million. It went from the charity foundation through a complex network of accounts in Cyprus and ended up in the pockets of a gambling syndicate in Macau. Julian isn't investing. Serena, he is paying off losses. And the mortgage? I asked, laughing softly as if he had just told a funny joke. I reached out and brushed lint off his lapel, lingering for the camera. Holden Enterprises bought the debt 3 months ago, Damon said. Technically, they own the deed. They can foreclose whenever they want. Good, I said, because I own Holden Enterprises. Damon's eyes widened slightly, then he chuckled. Remind me never to cross you. Now, I said, shifting my tone, I need to give them a soundbite. Ready. I leaned in closer, my lips brushing his ear. I raised my voice just a fraction, projecting toward where I knew Rick was straining to listen. You promised to keep this secret, don't you? I pleaded, injecting a note of desperate passion into my voice. If Julian finds out, it will be over. He doesn't know about us. He doesn't know what we are doing. He won't know, Damon replied, playing along perfectly. We will make it quick. By tomorrow night, it will all be finished. I just want to be free, I said, placing a thick manila envelope on the table between us. It contained the original deeds to the house, which I had retrieved from the bank that morning. But to Rick, it looked like a stack of love letters, or perhaps transfer documents for stolen money. Take this. It has everything you need to proceed. Damon covered the folder with his hand. Flash. I saw the tiny reflection of the lens in the mirror behind the bar. Rick had the shot, the money shot, the wife handing off the package to the lover. The wife is begging for secrecy. We stayed for another 20 minutes, drinking wine and looking conspiratorial. When we left, Damon walked me to my car. He leaned in and kissed me on the cheek, his hand lingering on my waist. Give them hell, Serena, he whispered. I intend to, I said. I drove back to the Hamptons with the radio off. My heart was beating in a steady, slow rhythm. The trap was sprung. Rick was undoubtedly racing back to Victoria right now with his golden evidence. They would spend the next 24 hours celebrating their victory, high-fiving each other over my stupidity. When I entered the house, it was past 1 a.m. The foyer was dark, but a light spilled from the cracks of the living room door. I walked past quietly. Julian was sitting on the sofa, his back to me. He was typing furiously on his phone. I stopped. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't resist. I crept closer, peering through the gap in the door frame. He was smiling. It was a genuine smile, one I hadn't seen directed at me in years. I focused on the screen of his phone. The font size was set to large. Julian had terrible eyesight but refused to wear glasses. I could read the text message clearly from 10 feet away. Recipient my sweet Clara. Message. Just hold on. Baby, Mother has the proof. We got her. 1 more week and I will kick that witch out of the house. We will have the whole place to ourselves. The nightmare is almost over. I stared at the word witch. I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel betrayed. Those feelings belonged to a woman who no longer existed. I felt efficient. I walked up the stairs to the guest room. I had started sleeping there, because of his snoring, and lay down on the crisp, cold sheets. 1 more week, he had said. He was wrong. He didn't have a week. He had less than 24 hours. Tomorrow was his birthday, and I was going to give him a gift that would leave a scar on his soul forever. I closed my eyes and visualized the seating chart. Table 9. Enjoy the view from the top while you can. Julian, I whispered into the darkness, because the fall is going to be a long way down. The week leading up to the birthday party felt less like a celebration and more like the synchronized tightening of a noose. The atmosphere in the Thorne household was suffocatingly polite. Victoria had stopped making snide comments about my background. Instead, she treated me with the distant, pitying kindness one might show a terminal patient who does not yet know they are dying. It was Tuesday morning, 4 days before the event, when she dropped the other shoe. We were seated in the solarium for breakfast. The morning sun filtered through the glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, the only thing in this house that Victoria could not control. She stirred her Earl Grey tea with a silver spoon, the chiming sound sharp and rhythmic. I have made a slight adjustment to the itinerary for Saturday, she announced, not looking up from her cup. During the main course, we will have a special presentation, a commemorative retrospective of Julian's life, 40 years of excellence. I buttered my toast. Keeping my hand steady, I knew exactly what that meant. It would start with baby pictures, move through his mediocre college years, highlight his charity work, and then, at the climax, it would pivot. The screen would darken, the tone would shift. And the photos of me with Damon Vance, the ones Rick Slattery had so diligently captured, would be projected 10 feet high for 300 guests to see. It was a public execution disguised as a slideshow. "That sounds lovely, Victoria," I said, taking a bite. "Julian loves seeing himself on screen." "Yes," she smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. "It will be a moment of truth, a defining moment for the family. I want everything to be transparent. No more secrets." "I agree," I replied, meeting her gaze. "Transparency is so important." She had no idea that my version of transparency involved a forensic audit and federal indictments. While Victoria busied herself with the caterers, I slipped away to the city. I had told her I needed a final fitting for my dress. In reality, I had a meeting with the only person in this messy equation who was arguably more foolish than my husband, his mistress. I had found Clara easily. The receipt for the diamond necklace had a delivery code associated with a modeling agency in Soho. A quick cross-reference of the agency's New Faces board with Julian's recent Instagram likes led me straight to Clara Evans. I am 23 years old, blonde, leggy, a struggling commercial model who listed manifesting as a hobby on her profile. I did not storm into her apartment. I did not slash her tires. That is what an emotional amateur does. Instead, I booked her. I had Marcus, my assistant at Aegis, contact her agency to book her for a corporate lifestyle shoot for a high-end consultancy firm. The rate was triple her usual fee. She arrived at the studio I had rented in Chelsea promptly at 10 in the morning, looking eager and breathless. I was waiting in the green room. When she walked in, she froze. She recognized me. I saw the panic flare in her eyes, the way her hand went instinctively to her throat, where the $50,000 diamond necklace I had paid for was resting. "Mrs. Thorne?" she stammered, backing toward the door. I think there has been a mistake." "Sit down, Clara," I said. My voice was not angry, it was tiring. I gestured to the plush velvet chair opposite me. "There is no photographer, but you will still get paid for your time. I just want to talk." She hesitated, then sat on the edge of the chair, looking ready to bolt. "If this is about Julian, he told me you were separated. He said you lived in separate wings. He said it was over." "It is over," I said, pouring 2 cups of water from a carafe. I pushed one toward her. "I am not here to scratch your eyes out, Clara. I am here to give you a heads up. I am leaving him." Her shoulders dropped 2 inches. The relief was palpable. You are..." "Yes," I lied smoothly. "I am tired of the pretense. I am tired of his mother. I am signing the papers next week. But before I go, I want to see the woman who is taking my place. I wanted to make sure you know what you are signing up for." Clara blinked, her blue eyes widening. "Julian says we are going to travel. He says once the divorce is final, we are going to live in Paris for a year. He is going to produce my portfolio." I almost laughed. Julian couldn't produce a grocery list, let alone a portfolio. "Paris sounds expensive," I mused. "Did he tell you about the cash flow problems?" "He said that is just temporary," Clara said defensively. "He said once he gets control of his trust fund, everything will be fine. He said his mother is the problem. He told me she is a leech." "A leech?" I raised an eyebrow, leaning in. "He says she is bleeding the estate dry," Clara continued, gaining confidence now that she felt we were on the same side, 2 women commiserating about a difficult man. "He told me she moves money around to hide it from the IRS. He called her a control freak who manipulates the books. He said he can't wait to put her in a home and sell that dusty old house in the Hamptons." My heart did a little flip. It was perfect. She was reciting his pillow talk, and every word was a nail in his coffin. "I see," I said, my tone sympathetic. "He must be under so much pressure. It is hard to keep track of all the lies, isn't it?" "It is," Clara exclaimed. "Last week he was crying in my arms, saying he feels like a fraud. He admitted he lost $100,000 gambling in Atlantic City and had to borrow it from some loan shark. He was terrified you would find out." I reached into my purse and pulled out a check. It was for the full amount of the booking fee. "Thank you, Clara," I said, sliding the check across the table. "You have been very helpful. I wish you the best of luck with Julian. You are going to need it." I stood up and left before she could ask any more questions. As I walked down the hallway, I tapped the stop button on the voice recorder app on my phone. The audio was crystal clear. Julian admitting to tax fraud. Julian is plotting to institutionalize his mother. Julian admitting to gambling debts. I had the mistress on tape destroying him, and the best part was, she thought she was defending him. I returned to the Hamptons just in time for the final humiliation. It was Friday evening. The house was buzzing with activity. A team of lighting technicians was installing gels on the spotlights in the ballroom. Victoria was in the library, inspecting the linens. When I walked in, she didn't greet me. She simply pointed to a garment bag hanging on the door. "The dry cleaners are incompetent," she snapped. "They put a double crease in Julian's tuxedo trousers, and the lapel on his jacket is sitting wrong. I need it fixed." "I can call the tailor," I suggested. "The tailor is in the city," Victoria said, "and the party starts in 24 hours. You know how to iron, don't you, Serena? I assume it was a skill you picked up in your modest upbringing." The insult was so petty, so unnecessary. She wanted to see me doing menial labor. She wanted to remind me of my place one last time before she kicked me out. "Of course, Victoria," I said. "I would be happy to do it." I took the suit up to the master bedroom. I set up the ironing board. I filled the iron with water, and as the steam hissed, rising into the air, I went to work. But I wasn't just pressing fabric. I reached into my sewing kit, a small travel case I always kept in my luggage. Inside, hidden within a spool of black thread, was a device smaller than a dime. It was a high-frequency listening bug, the kind corporate spies use to steal trade secrets. It had a battery life of 48 hours and a range of 2 miles. I turned Julian's jacket inside out. I found the small opening in the lining near the vent at the back, a place where the fabric was thickest and stiffest. I slipped the bug inside, pushing it deep into the seam. Then, with a few deft stitches, I closed the hole. I pressed the steam iron over the spot, flattening the fabric perfectly. Now, wherever Julian went during the party, I would hear him. I would hear his whispers to his mother. I would hear his panicked breathing when the trap snapped shut. I would hear everything. I finished the suit and hung it back in the closet, looking pristine and sharp, a Trojan horse made of Italian wool. That night, I stood before the full-length mirror in the guest room. The house was finally quiet. The storm was coming. I looked at my reflection. For 5 years, I had tried to soften my edges to fit into the round hole of the Thorne family expectations. I lowered my voice. I had dimmed my intelligence. I had dressed in pastels and pearls. I reached up and unpinned my hair, letting it fall in a dark curtain around my shoulders. I wiped off the pale pink lipstick I wore to please Victoria and looked at my bare face. The eyes staring back were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of the senior crisis manager of Aegis Solutions. They were eyes that had stared down federal prosecutors and hostile board members. "You wanted a villain, Victoria," I whispered to the empty room. "Tomorrow, I will show you what a villain really looks like." I walked over to the desk where my laptop sat open. I had one final task. I logged into the secure portal of the shell company I had created 6 months ago, Nemesis Holdings. It was a subsidiary of a subsidiary, buried under layers of corporate obfuscation, but the primary shareholder was me. I pulled up the loan agreement for the Thorne Estate mortgage, which I had purchased from the bank's distressed asset division for 60 cents on the dollar. It had cost me $8 million, nearly every cent of the bonuses and investment returns I had accrued over a decade of working 80-hour weeks. It was a gamble. If the property value tanked, I would lose everything. But I knew real estate in the Hamptons. The land alone was worth $20 million. I navigated to the foreclosure tab. The system showed the status payment default, 90 days past due. I hovered the mouse over the button marked Execute Writ of Possession. I didn't click it yet. The timing had to be perfect. The writ needed to be served when the house was full, when the maximum number of witnesses were present to see the fall. I set a timer on my phone. It's 12 noon. Tomorrow. I closed the laptop and turned off the light. I lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs. It sounded different tonight. It didn't sound like chaos. It sounded like applause. Tomorrow, Julian will turn 40. Tomorrow, Victoria will try to destroy me. And tomorrow, when the candles were blown out, they would realize that they were standing in a house that already belonged to the woman they called a whore. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Hampton sky in bruised shades of purple and charcoal, signaling the start of the performance. The Thorne estate, usually a cold mausoleum of limestone and regret, had been transformed into a glittering palace of light. Floodlights bathed the facade in a warm, golden glow, masking the cracks in the masonry that I now knew were structural. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of 5,000 imported white lilies and the metallic tang of expensive caviar. From the top of the grand staircase, I watched the guests arrive. It was a parade of power. There were senators who made laws they didn't read, tech billionaires who sold data they didn't own, and socialites whose faces were pulled so tight they looked permanently surprised. They flowed into the foyer like a river of diamonds and black tie, their laughter echoing off the marble floors, a sound that was bright, brittle, and entirely devoid of joy. Victoria had sent a maid to my room at 5 o'clock with a dress bag. Inside was a gown of pale, dusty rose chiffon. It was demure, retiring, and utterly forgettable. It was a dress designed for a woman who fades into the wallpaper, a dress for a victim. I left it on the bed, still in the plastic. Instead, I stepped into the gown I had commissioned secretly from a designer in Milan 3 weeks ago. It was scarlet, not a polite red, but a deep, violent crimson that looked like fresh arterial blood under the lights. It was structured silk, strapless, with a neckline that plunged just enough to be dangerous and a slit that rose high on the thigh. It was a dress that did not ask for attention. It demanded submission. I checked my reflection one last time. I applied a coat of lipstick that matched the silk perfectly. Then, I walked out of the room. As I descended the staircase, the hum of conversation in the foyer faltered, then died completely. 300 heads turned upward. I saw the shock ripple through the crowd. In a sea of black tuxedos and safe, neutral gowns, I was a flare in the night. I locked eyes with Victoria across the room. She was holding a flute of champagne, wearing silver, looking like an ice queen. When she saw me, her hand jerked, spilling a splash of vintage Dom Perignon onto her glove. Her eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated rage. She had scripted a funeral for me, and I had arrived dressed for a coronation. I reached the bottom of the stairs and was immediately flanked by the sharks. Serena. It was Clarissa Vanderbilt again, her eyes raking over my dress with a mixture of envy and scandal. My goodness, that is, bold. Victoria said the theme was understated elegance. I must have missed the memo, I said, flashing a smile that showed too many teeth. Besides, it is a celebration. Why blend in? Before she could respond, a hand clamped onto my upper arm. It was firm, possessive, and painful. Darling, Julian's voice purred in my ear. I turned to face my husband. He looked devastatingly handsome in the tuxedo I had bugged the night before. His hair was perfect. His smile was blinding. And the smell of his cologne sandalwood and deception filled my senses. To the cameras flashing around us, he was the doting husband greeting his stunning wife. But his fingers were digging into my bicep hard enough to bruise. "You are wearing red," he hissed through his smiling teeth, leaning in for a cheek kiss that looked affectionate but felt like a threat. "Mother is going to have a stroke. You were told to wear pink." I felt like making a statement. "Julian," I whispered back, leaning into his touch as if I adored him. "Do you like it?" He squeezed harder, his thumb pressing into the sensitive nerve near my armpit. "You look like a whore," he murmured, his voice low and venomous. "But don't worry. Enjoy the attention tonight. Soak it up, because by tomorrow morning, The only thing you will be wearing is a trash bag. I love you too, darling, I said loudly. For the benefit of the photographer from Vanity Fair who was snapping our picture, Julian released me abruptly and turned to shake hands with the CEO of a rival bank, his mask of charm sliding back into place instantly. Robert, so good to see you. Have you tried the scotch? It is a 25-year single malt. I drifted away, moving through the crowd like a shark in a reef. The room was a masterclass in hypocrisy. I passed groups of men discussing the market crash while sipping wine that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. I passed women complimenting each other's surgeries while texting their lovers. I made my way to the bar, keeping my ears open. In this world, acoustic privacy was a myth. People assumed that because the music was loud, a live jazz quartet playing in the corner, they could not be heard. But I had trained my hearing in boardrooms where whispers destroyed companies. I give it 2 weeks, a voice said from a cluster of tuxedos near the ice sculpture. I recognized the speaker. It was one of Julian's college friends, a man named Baxter who had never worked a day in his life. 2 weeks, another man laughed. You are an optimist. Did you see Victoria's face when she walked in wearing that red flag? The old dragon has the papers ready. I heard Arthur Pym talking about it in the cloakroom. They are cutting her loose tonight. Poor girl, a woman's voice chimed in, sounding bored. She really thought she was one of us, didn't she? It is almost tragic, like watching a dog try to walk on its hind legs. Well, I have $5,000 that says she makes a scene when they serve her. Baxter chuckled. She is from Queens, isn't she? You can take the girl out of the ghetto, I took a sip of my sparkling water. They were betting on my destruction. They were treating my life as a spectator sport. $5,000. I thought, Baxter, you don't have $5,000. I saw your credit report when I bought the debt on your penthouse last month. I didn't turn around. I didn't throw my drink in their faces. I simply smiled at the bartender and walked away. Their mockery didn't sting anymore. It just confirmed that when the hammer fell, I would feel no remorse for any of them. The chimes for dinner sounded a soft, melodic gong that resonated through the halls. The crowd began to migrate toward the grand ballroom. The ballroom was a cavern of excess. The ceiling was draped in white silk, and thousands of orchids cascaded from the chandeliers. The tables were set with gold-rimmed china and crystal stemware, and there, at the front of the room, was the head table. I walked toward it, my head high. I saw the place cards. Julian was in the center. Victoria was to his right, and to his left. To his left was the empty seat where I should have been, but the card didn't say my name. It said Senator Miller. My seat was, as I had discovered earlier, at table 9, near the kitchen doors. I stopped. The room went quiet as people found their seats and realized the discrepancy. The wife of the birthday boy was being exiled to the cheap seats. It was a public snub so vicious it drew a collective gasp. I looked at Victoria. She was already seated, arranging her napkin on her lap. She looked up at me and raised a single, perfectly arched eyebrow. It was a dare. Make a scene, her eyes said. Show them you are trash. I didn't move to table 9. Instead, I walked straight to the head table. I stopped behind the chair labeled Senator Miller. The senator, a portly man with a red face, looked uncomfortable. Senator, I said, my voice projecting clearly in the sudden silence. I believe there has been a clerical error. Surely you wouldn't want to separate a wife from her husband on such a momentous occasion. The senator looked at Victoria, then at me. He saw the fire in my eyes. He was a politician. He knew a losing battle when he saw one. Of course not, Mrs. Thorne, he stammered, standing up. My apologies. Please. He scuttled away to find another seat. I sat down next to Julian. I felt him stiffen beside me. What do you think you are doing? He whispered, his hand gripping the tablecloth. Eating dinner, Julian, I replied, unfolding my napkin with a snap. Try the foie gras. I hear it is to die for. Victoria looked like she had swallowed a lemon, but she couldn't cause a scene now. The spotlight was on us. She had to play the game. The dinner was an endurance test. 5 courses of rich, heavy food that tasted like ash in my mouth. I sat there, radiating calm, while Julian sweated through his shirt. I made polite conversation with the guests, charming the very people who had been betting on my divorce 20 minutes ago. Finally, as the waiters cleared the dessert plates, chocolate tortes dusted with gold leaf, the lights in the ballroom dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. Victoria stood up. A spotlight hit her, turning her silver dress into a column of light. She walked to the podium at the center of the stage, holding a microphone like a scepter. "My dear friends," she began, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "Thank you for being here tonight to celebrate my son, Julian. 40 years ago, I held him in my arms for the first time, and I knew he was destined for greatness." She paused for applause. The room clapped obediently. "The Thorne legacy," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "is built on pillars, strength, tradition, and above all, honor." She looked out at the audience, her eyes sweeping over the room before landing heavily on me. "We value loyalty above all else," she said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "We welcome those who share our values. We open our hearts and our homes, but—" She let the word hang in the air. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew what was coming. They leaned forward in their chairs, hungry for blood. "But sometimes," Victoria said, her voice hardening, "we are deceived. Sometimes we invite shadows into our light. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who hold the knife." Julian looked down at his lap, playing the part of the wounded saint. "Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of the future," Victoria said. "But we cannot move into the future without cleansing the past. We cannot build on a foundation of lies. It breaks a mother's heart to see her son betrayed, to see his generosity abused by those who sought only to climb a ladder of greed." She was staring directly at me now. The spotlight seemed to follow her gaze, pinning me in my red dress against the dark background. "I promised Julian honesty," she declared, "and I promised this family that I would protect its name. So, before we cut the cake, I feel it is my duty to reveal the truth, because the truth, no matter how painful, sets us free." She gestured to the technician in the back of the room. "Roll the tape," she commanded. "But sadly," she added, her voice dripping with mock sorrow, "there are those who have trampled on our trust, those who have taken our love and sold it for cheap thrills in dark corners." The lights in the ballroom cut out completely, plunging us into darkness. A giant screen descended from the ceiling behind the stage, the mechanical whirring sound echoing in the silence. I sat perfectly still in the dark. I took a sip of my wine. I felt Julian shift beside me, preparing his face for the look of devastated shock he had practiced in the mirror. They were expecting to see grainy photos of me and Damon Vance. They were expecting to see the end of Serena Graymont. I smiled into the rim of my glass. "Go ahead, Victoria. I thought, play your movie. But remember, I am the one who edited the final cut." The projector hummed to life. A beam of white light cut through the darkness, hitting the screen. The show was about to begin. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, cold glow over the hundreds of faces upturned in the dark. It was not a montage of Julian's childhood. It was not a retrospective of his philanthropy. It was a sniper shot aimed directly at the center of my forehead. The first image was grainy, shot in high-contrast black and white, giving it the tawdry aesthetic of a police surveillance file. It was me. I was sitting in the booth at the Obsidian Room, leaning across the table. My hand was resting on Damon's hand. The angle was masterful. Rick Slattery had positioned himself perfectly to obscure the gap between our faces. On the screen, 10 feet high, it did not look like two colleagues exchanging a flash drive. It looked like two lovers sharing a secret just seconds before a kiss. A ripple of shock went through the room. It started at the front tables and rolled backward like a wave. I heard the sharp intake of breath from the woman behind me. I heard a glass shatter somewhere near the bar. The image changed. Now it was Damon leaning in, his lips close to my ear. I was laughing, my head thrown back, my neck exposed. It looked intimate, It looked relaxed. It looked like the behavior of a woman who had forgotten she was married. Then came the audio. Victoria had clearly hired a professional sound engineer to clean up Rick's recording. The background noise of the bar, the clinking glasses, the low hum of jazz had been scrubbed away, leaving only my voice, stark and undeniable, booming through the surround sound speakers of the ballroom. My husband must not know about this. The sentence hung in the air, stripped of its context. Then, a splice, a jagged cut to another sentence. We have to make it quick. By tomorrow night, it will all be finished. And finally, the death blow. I just want to be free. The audio cut out with a sharp pop, plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the kind of silence that usually follows a gunshot. For 3 seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. The only sound was the hum of the projector cooling down. Then, the murmurs began. They started low, a buzzing of angry bees, and quickly swelled into a roar of judgment. I felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes drilling into me. They were not looking at Serena, the crisis manager. They were not looking at Serena, the wife. They were looking at Serena, the interloper, the gold digger who had finally been caught with her hand in the cookie jar. I saw Clarissa Vanderbilt cover her mouth with a diamond-encrusted hand, her eyes wide with feigned horror, though I could see the gleam of delight underneath. She was loving this. They all were. This was better than the opera. This was the public destruction of an outsider. Victoria did not let the moment cool. She signaled for the spotlights to return, blindingly bright, centered directly on the head table. She stood there, towering in her silver gown, looking down at me with the righteous fury of an avenging angel. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at me. "Serena Graymont," she announced, her voice booming through the microphone without a tremor. "You sat at my table, you ate my food, you wore the name of my ancestors, and all the while, you were plotting your exit with a stranger in a bar." She gestured grandly to the blank screen behind her. "We welcomed you," she continued, her voice thick with performative grief. "Despite your background, despite your lack of pedigree, we gave you a home. We gave you a life most women only dream of. And this is how you repay my son, with deceit, with cheap, tawdry betrayal in the middle of the night." I sat perfectly still. My hands were folded in my lap. I did not look down. I did not fidget. I stared straight ahead, locking eyes with the woman who was trying to burn me alive. "You have violated Clause 4B of your prenuptial agreement," Victoria declared, dropping the emotional facade for the cold, hard steel of legalese. "Infidelity is a breach of contract. It is a termination of our arrangement effective immediately." She took a step closer to me, invading my personal space. The scent of her expensive perfume was cloying, masking the smell of her desperation. "I demand that you leave this house," she hissed into the microphone, ensuring the back row could hear every syllable. "Right now, you will leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage, which, if I recall correctly, was absolutely nothing." The crowd gasped again. It was brutal. It was a public eviction. Beside me, Julian made his move. He pushed his chair back with a violent scrape against the floorboards. He stood up, his face flushed, his eyes wet with tears that he must have summoned by biting the inside of his cheek. "Why?" he cried out, his voice cracking perfectly. He turned to me, his hands shaking. "Why? Serena, I gave you everything. I loved you. I defended you when people said you were only after the money. I stood by you." He looked out at the audience, begging for their sympathy. "I trusted her," he sobbed to the room at large. "I was planning to take her to Paris next month. I was going to renew our vows, and she was with him." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with exaggerated sobs. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar, or at least a daytime Emmy. A murmur of sympathy swept through the room. Poor Julian. They were whispering. "He is so sensitive. He didn't deserve this." I watched him with clinical detachment. I knew that less than 24 hours ago. He was texting Clara about kicking the witch out. I knew that the Paris trip was for his mistress, not me. I knew that the tears were not for the loss of his marriage, but for the relief of his salvation. He thought he was free. He thought the plan had worked. Two large men in dark suits materialized from the shadows near the stage. They were not the usual event security. These were private contractors, hired specifically for intimidation. They walked toward the head table, their steps heavy, their faces impassive. They stopped 3 feet from my chair, forming a wall of muscle. The threat was clear. Leave, or be dragged out. Victoria reached under the podium and pulled out a thick blue folder. She threw it onto the table in front of me. It landed with a heavy slap, sliding across the white linen and knocking over a crystal salt shaker. "These are the divorce papers," Victoria said, her voice icy. "They have been drafted by Mr. Pym and witnessed by the court. They relinquish all your claims to the Thorne estate. The assets, and any spousal support. You have no leverage. Serena, we have the photos. We have the recordings. We have the moral high ground." She pointed a manicured finger at the document. "Sign it," she commanded. "Sign it, confess to your adultery, and get out of my sight before I have these gentlemen remove you like the trash you are." The room was so quiet, I could hear the wind rattling the window panes against the storm outside. The air was thick with tension. Every eye was fixed on me. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for the tears, the begging, the denial. They wanted me to fall to my knees and plead for forgiveness. They wanted to see the strong, successful career woman reduced to a weeping mess. I looked at the papers. I looked at the security guards. I looked at Julian, who was peeking through his fingers to see if I was broken yet. I looked at Victoria, who was standing tall, breathing hard, her chest heaving with the thrill of her victory. Slowly, deliberately, I reached out. I did not pick up the pen. I picked up my glass of wine. It was a bold Cabernet, dark as blood. I brought the glass to my lips. My hand was steady as a rock. I took a long, slow sip, letting the tannins coat my tongue. I swallowed. I set the glass back down on the table with a soft clink that echoed in the silence. I looked at Victoria. I looked deep into her eyes, searching for even a flicker of humanity, and found only greed. And then, I leaned back in my chair, tilted my head toward the crystal chandelier above, and I laughed. It was not a nervous titter. It was not a hysterical shriek. It was a rich, full-throated laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has just heard the punchline to the world's greatest joke. It bubbled up from my chest, loud and genuine, filling the cavernous ballroom. I laughed at the absurdity of the photos. I laughed at the bad acting. I laughed at the plastic flowers and the rented tuxedos. I laughed because they thought they were the hunters, standing over a trapped animal, completely unaware that they were standing on a trapdoor and I was the one holding the lever. The sound of my laughter completely destabilized the room. Julian stopped sobbing and stared at me, his mouth hanging open. The security guards shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they should attack a laughing woman. Victoria took a step back, her triumph faltering for the first time. "You find this funny?" she screeched, her voice losing its composed veneer. "You find your destruction amusing?" I stopped laughing, but the smile remained on my face. It was a sharp, dangerous smile. I wiped a tear of mirth from the corner of my eye. "Oh, Victoria," I said, my voice calm, clear, and projecting to the back of the room without the need for a microphone. "I am not laughing at my destruction." I stood up. I smoothed the red silk of my dress. I looked at the crowd, then back at my mother-in-law. "I am laughing," I said, "because you think this is your house." The echo of my laughter faded, leaving behind a silence so absolute that the sound of the storm raging outside the mansion seemed to grow louder, battering against the glass like an angry god demanding entry. I did not sit back down. I did not wipe my eyes. Instead, I pushed my chair aside with a deliberate, scraping sound that grated against the nerves of every person in the ballroom. I walked toward the stage. Victoria stood frozen at the podium, her hand still gripping the microphone, her knuckles white. She looked like a statue of a tyrant that was about to be toppled. She watched me approach with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. She expected me to run for the exit. She expected me to crumble. She did not expect me to walk toward the fire. When I reached the stage, I didn't ask for permission. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the microphone. Victoria resisted for a fraction of a second, a pathetic tug of war, before the sheer force of my glare made her release her grip. She stumbled back a step, her silver dress rustling like dry leaves. I turned to face the crowd. 300 faces stared back at me, judges, executioners, and bystanders. I looked at the screen behind me, where the frozen image of Damon and me still loomed large, a testament to my supposed sin. "Thank you, Victoria," I said. My voice was calm, amplified by the speakers, filling every corner of the room. It was not the voice of a defensive wife. It was the voice of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. That was a truly cinematic performance. The lighting, the music, the dramatic editing, it must have cost a fortune, which is ironic, considering you don't have any. A murmur rippled through the front row. Victoria's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "But," I continued, pacing slowly across the stage, "you made a critical error in your casting. You forgot to introduce the leading man properly." I raised my arm and pointed a single, steady finger toward the massive double doors at the back of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice cutting through the air like a whip, "you have seen his face on the screen. You have heard the whispers of my infidelity. Now, I think it is time you met the man in the flesh." I nodded to the back. "Open the doors." The heavy oak doors swung open with a resounding boom. Damon Vance stood there, but he was not dressed in the leather jacket of a secret lover or the casual wear of a paramour. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, cut with military precision, and he was not alone. Flanking him were 4 men and women carrying leather briefcases, and behind them, 2 uniformed officers from the Economic Crimes Division of the State Police. The crowd gasped. The sound was like the air being sucked out of the room. This was not a romantic rendezvous. This was a raid. Damon began to walk down the center aisle. His stride was long and purposeful. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, people pulling their chairs back, desperate to avoid contact with the aura of authority radiating from him. He walked straight to the stage, climbed the stairs, and stood next to me. He didn't look at me with lust. He looked at me with the professional respect of a soldier acknowledging his commanding officer. He handed me a thick file folder. I held it up. "Victoria called this man my lover," I said, looking down at my mother-in-law, who was now clutching the edge of the podium for support. "Allow me to correct the record. This is Mr. Damon Vance. He is not a bartender. He is not a pool boy. He is a senior forensic auditor certified by the Department of Justice, specializing in high-level corporate fraud and embezzlement." I heard the word embezzlement land on the crowd like a physical blow. The senator in the front row uncrossed his legs and sat up very straight. "And these photos?" I gestured to the screen behind me. The secret meetings in dark corners, the hushed whispers, the exchanging of documents. I opened the folder Damon had given me and pulled out a stack of spreadsheets, waving them in the air. We weren't exchanging love letters, Victoria. We were exchanging bank records. I threw the papers into the air. They fluttered down like snow, landing at Victoria's feet. We were tracking the $50 million that has systematically vanished from the Thorn Hope Foundation over the last 5 years, I declared, my voice rising with righteous anger. $50 million that was donated by the people in this room, money that was promised to the pediatric oncology wing at St. Jude's, money that was supposed to save dying children. I paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. The room was deathly silent. "But that money never bought a single chemotherapy machine," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Instead, Mr. Vance here traced it through a labyrinth of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, all the way back to an account controlled by one person." I turned and looked at Victoria. She was pale, her skin the color of old parchment. She was shaking her head slightly, a wordless denial. "You," I said, You stole from children with cancer to pay for your plastic surgery, your vintage wine, and the very dress you are wearing right now. The crowd erupted. It wasn't just murmurs anymore. It was shouts of outrage. These were people who had written checks to that foundation. They were rich. Yes, but they had their own code of honor. And stealing from charity was a mortal sin. Lies, Victoria screamed. Finding her voice at last, she lunged toward me, her face twisted into a mask of ugliness. She is lying. She is a whore who is trying to distract you. Arrest her. Arrest her for slander. I am not done, I said, my voice cutting over hers. I signaled to the tech booth in the back, where my own hired specialist had quietly relieved Victoria's projectionist of his duties 5 minutes ago. You played a recording, I said. You heard me say, my husband must not know. I walked to the edge of the stage and looked down at Julian. He was sitting in his chair, looking small and terrified, like a child who had broken a vase. You wanted everyone to think I was hiding a lover, I said. But the reason I said Julian couldn't know was not because I was afraid of breaking his heart. It was because I was afraid he would steal the evidence. I pointed at him. If Julian knew I had found the remaining liquid assets of this family, the last scraps of money you hadn't yet wasted, he wouldn't have used it to save the house. He would have done exactly what he did last month in Macau. I snapped my fingers. The image on the giant screen flickered and changed. The photo of Damon and me vanished. In its place, a high-resolution scan of a casino marker appeared. It was from the Venetian Macau. It was dated 30 days ago. It was signed by Julian Thorne. The amount was staggering $2 million. He lost $2 million in a single night playing baccarat, I told the crowd. And when he couldn't pay, he offered the deed to this estate as collateral. But he couldn't sign it over, could he? Julian, because the bank already owned it. Julian jumped up. That is a fake, he shouted, his voice shrill. She forged it. She is a liar. Oh, I have plenty of real things to show. Darling, I said. I pressed the button on the remote I had concealed in my palm. The screen changed again. This time, it wasn't a document. It was a screenshot of a text message conversation. The font was large, clear, and undeniable. At the top, the contact name was My Sweet Clara. The timestamp was from yesterday. Julian. I can't wait to be done with this. The old witch is driving me crazy with her seating charts. Once we kick Serena out, I'm going to put Mother in a nursing home, somewhere cheap. She has outlived her usefulness. The gasp from the crowd this time was personal. They all knew Victoria. They all feared her. And to hear her golden boy, her beloved son, call her an old witch and plot to discard her was a betrayal of Shakespearean proportions. Victoria stared at the screen. She read the words. Her eyes bulged. She turned slowly to look at Julian. You, she whispered, you said that... No, Mother, Julian stammered, his hands waving frantically. She hacked my phone. She wrote that it is not real. Is this real? I asked. I clicked the remote again. A video played. It was grainy. Shot from a hidden camera, the one I had worn on my lapel during a lunch date with Julian 3 months ago. A date where I had specifically prodded him about his family. On the screen, Julian was drunk. He was holding a martini glass, slurring his words. My mother is a dinosaur, the video Julian said, laughing. She thinks she is the Queen of England. I just need her to sign over the trust fund, and then she can rot in that house for all I care. And Serena is so boring. She works all the time, but at least she pays the bills while I have fun with Clara. The video cut. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hanging at the top of its arc. Julian looked around the room. He saw the disgust on the faces of his friends. He saw the horror on the faces of his investors. He saw the cold, dead realization in his mother's eyes. He snapped. With a primal scream of rage, Julian lunged at the stage. He vaulted over the flower arrangements, his face purple, his veins bulging in his neck. You bitch, he screamed, reaching for me. "I will kill you. Turn it off. Turn it off." He scrambled up the stairs, his hands clawed into fists, ready to strike. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Because before he could get within 5 feet of me, a wall of black fabric materialized. The 2 security guards, who had been standing by the stage, the ones Victoria thought were hers, stepped forward, but they didn't grab me. One of them caught Julian in midair. It was a professional takedown, efficient and brutal. He slammed Julian onto the hard wood of the stage floor. "Stay down," the guard barked, twisting Julian's arm behind his back. Julian writhed, screaming obscenities, his tuxedo tearing at the shoulder. "Get off me. Do you know who I am? I am Julian Thorne. I will pay your salary." The guard looked down at him, unimpressed. "Actually," the guard said, his voice calm enough for the microphone to pick up, "Mrs. Graymont pays my salary, and she pays double for overtime." I walked over to where Julian was pinned to the floor. I looked down at him. He looked up at me. His eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and terror. He looked pathetic. The golden boy was just gilded rot. I looked back at the crowd. "You asked me to leave, Victoria," I said, turning to where she stood trembling by the podium. "You told me to take what I brought into this marriage and get out." I signaled to Damon. He handed me one final document. It was bound in red leather. "I brought my intelligence," I said. "I brought my work ethic, and I brought my money." I held the red folder up. "But it seems," I said, a small, cold smile playing on my lips, "that I am also taking something with me." I opened the folder. "This is the deed to the Thorne estate," I announced. Or rather, the foreclosure notice that was executed at 12 noon today. I looked at the stunned faces of the Hamptons elite. "Holden Enterprises isn't a bank," I said. "It is a holding company, and I am the sole shareholder." I dropped the folder onto Julian's chest. "So," I said, my voice ringing with finality, "technically, you are trespassing." "Liar." The word tore from Victoria's throat, a ragged, desperate sound that had none of the operatic elegance she had displayed only minutes before. She gripped the sides of the podium so hard that one of her acrylic nails snapped with a sharp crack, the plastic flying off into the front row. Her composure, that iron mask she had worn for 40 years, didn't just crack, it shattered. "This is my house," she screamed, her voice scaling up into a register that hurt the ears. She pointed a trembling finger at the floor, stomping her heel against the wood. "My father built this estate. My blood is in these walls. You are nothing but a squatter, a filth. You think a few forged papers and a hired actor can take this away from me. I am Victoria Thorne." She looked out at the audience, her eyes wild, pleading for validation. "Tell her," she shrieked at the silent crowd. "Tell her who I am. Tell her she has no right." But nobody spoke. The room was a vacuum. The elite of the Hamptons, usually so quick to rally around their own, were paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the evidence that had just been displayed. They were looking at the casino marker, they were looking at the text messages, and they were looking at me, standing calm and untouched in my red dress, holding a folder that looked less like a legal document and more like a weapon. "You are right about one thing, Victoria," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a scalpel. "Your blood is in these walls, but unfortunately for you, blood is not a currency accepted by the bank." I took a step closer to her. The security guards who were holding Julian down watched me, waiting for orders. Julian had stopped struggling. He was lying cheek to floor, staring at my shoes, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "You keep shouting about ownership," I continued, opening the red leather folder I had retrieved from Damon. "But ownership is a tricky concept. It is not about sentiment. It is not about history. It is about solvency." I pulled out a document. It was thick, bound in blue legal backing, and stamped with the official seal of the Suffolk County Clerk. "You mentioned Holden Enterprises," I said, addressing the room but keeping my eyes locked on Victoria. "The mysterious creditor that bought your mortgage 3 months ago. You probably thought they were just another faceless investment firm, perhaps a hedge fund looking to diversify. You ignored their letters. You ignored their warnings. You assumed that because you are a thorn, the rules of debt did not apply to you. I held the document up to the light. Holden, I said, tasting the word. It is an interesting name, isn't it? I chose it myself. It is the middle name of the grandfather who raised me, the mechanic you loved to mock, the man whose hands were always dirty with grease so mine could be clean. Victoria's face went slack. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Holden Enterprises is a single-member limited liability company, I explained, my tone conversational, as if I were giving a lecture on corporate structure. And that single member is me. A collective gasp went through the room, louder than the last. I saw the realization hit them. I hadn't just found the debt. I had bought it. I purchased the note on this estate for $8 million, I said. It was a steal, really. The bank considered it a toxic asset because you hadn't made a payment in 6 months. They were happy to get it off their books, and because I own the debt, I also own the enforcement rights. I turned to the page with the timestamp. According to the terms of the mortgage, which you signed 15 years ago to fund Julian's failed venture capital firm, the creditor has the right to immediate foreclosure after 90 days of non-payment. Today marked day 91. I looked at my watch. It was a diamond-encrusted Cartier, a gift to myself. At 12 noon today, I said, while you were yelling at the florists and Julian was drinking scotch by the pool, my lawyers filed the writ of possession with the county court. The deed was transferred electronically at 12:01. I closed the folder with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. Technically speaking, Victoria, I said, offering her a cold, tight smile. You are standing in my living room. Victoria stumbled back, her knees finally giving way. She caught herself on the podium, sliding down until she was clutching the wooden stand for support. She looked around the ballroom, the silk drapes, the crystal chandeliers, the flowers she had agonized over. No, she whispered. No, it is impossible. It is entirely possible, I corrected. In fact, it is done. This entire event, the champagne, the caviar, the orchestra I paid for the vendors to stay. Of course, I didn't want to ruin the evening. I turned to the crowd, spreading my arms in a gesture of welcoming hospitality. Welcome to my housewarming party, I announced. I apologize for the confusion. The previous tenants were just leaving. I looked down at Julian. He was trying to push himself up, his face a mask of confusion and rage. You can't do this, he spat, saliva flying from his mouth. You can't just take the house. I have rights. I have my trust fund. I will hire the best lawyers in New York and I will bury you. Ah, I said, holding up a finger. I am glad you brought that up, darling. The trust fund. I walked over to where he lay. I didn't help him up. I circled him like a shark circling a shipwreck. You see, Julian, you have always been terrible with paperwork, I said. You find it boring. You sign things without reading them because you assume the world exists to serve you. I reached into the red folder again and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a complex legal filing. It was a standard form, simple and deadly. Do you remember 6 months ago? I asked. You came home drunk from the club. You had crashed your Aston Martin into a parked car in the city. You were terrified the press would find out. You were crying in the kitchen, begging me to fix it. Julian's eyes widened. He remembered. I told you I needed you to sign some insurance forms so I could handle the liability claims, I recounted. I told you I needed authorization to speak to the other driver's lawyers, and you were so wasted you couldn't even hold the pen straight. You just scribbled your signature where I pointed and went to bed. I turned the paper around so he could see it. This isn't an insurance form, Julian. It is a durable power of attorney. Julian stared at the document, his face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. It grants me full, irrevocable authority over your personal finances, your investments, and yes, your family trust distributions, I said, my voice dripping with satisfaction. I activated it the next morning, for the last 6 months, Every dime that the trust has released to you hasn't gone into your account. It has gone into a secured escrow account controlled by me. You stole my money, he whispered. I didn't steal it, I corrected him. I managed it. I used it to pay off the legitimate debts you owed to people who actually work for a living. I paid the caterers you stiffed last year. I paid the contractor who fixed the roof. And the rest, I used it to buy the shell company that bought this house. I leaned down, bringing my face close to his. You bought this house for me. Julian, I whispered. Thank you. It is the best birthday present you ever gave me. I stood up and looked at the crowd. The transformation in the room was absolute. 5 minutes ago, they were looking at me with disdain. Now, they were looking at the Thorns with something far worse, revulsion. In high society, scandals are tolerated, adultery is common, even cruelty is accepted. But being broke, being a fraud, that is an unforgivable sin. The Thorns weren't just ruined, they were radioactive. I saw Senator Miller stand up. He adjusted his jacket, signaled to his wife, and began to walk briskly toward the exit, keeping his head down. Senator, Victoria cried out, reaching a hand toward him. Senator, please, you know us. You know who we are. Senator Miller didn't even pause. He stepped around her outstretched hand as if she were a beggar on the street. I am afraid I have an early morning, he muttered to the air, not making eye contact. Terrible misunderstanding. Good evening. That broke the dam. Suddenly, the room was in motion. 300 guests, the cream of New York society, began to retreat. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't make excuses. They simply fled. They grabbed their furs and their clutches, turning their backs on the family they had toasted only an hour ago. Clarissa! Julian shouted from the floor, spotting his mother's friend. Clarissa, tell them this is insane. Clarissa Vanderbilt paused near the door. She looked back at the stage. She looked at Julian, disheveled and pinned by a guard. She looked at Victoria, broken and weeping, and then she looked at me, standing tall in my red dress, the owner of everything. She gave me a small, respectful nod, a recognition of power. Then she turned and walked out the door. Within 2 minutes, the ballroom was empty. The silence was deafening. The only people left were the staff, the security team, Damon, the police officers, and the three of us. The party was over. The dynasty was dead. I walked back to the podium where Victoria was slumped. She looked smaller now. The grandiosity was gone, replaced by the frail reality of an old woman who had nothing left. She looked up at me, tears streaking her heavy makeup, creating black rivers down her cheeks. Why, she croaked. Why did you have to do it like this? You could have just divorced him. You could have just left. I could have, I agreed. But you didn't want a divorce. Victoria, you wanted destruction. You wanted to strip me naked and throw me to the wolves. You wanted to take my dignity. I closed the red folder and handed it back to Damon. You wanted to kick out a cheating daughter-in-law, I said, looking down at her with zero pity. You wanted a villain for your little melodrama, but that is the problem with writing a script you don't understand. I leaned in closer, ensuring she heard every syllable. I didn't cheat, Victoria. I never cheated. I just acquired it. I turned my back on her. I signaled to the police officers who were waiting patiently by the door. Officers, I said, my voice cool and professional. I believe you have some warrants to execute regarding the embezzlement of the Thorn Hope Foundation funds. The suspects are all yours. I walked toward the side of the stage, my heels clicking on the wood. I didn't look back as the officers moved in. The jingle of handcuffs the only music left in the room. I had one more thing to do before I closed the book on the Thorn family forever. I needed a drink, and this time, it would be from my own cellar. The arrival of the officers was not dramatic in the way movies portray it. There were no sirens wailing in the driveway, no guns drawn, no shouting of rights. It was far more clinical, which made it infinitely more terrifying. It was the quiet, bureaucratic dismantling of a life. The two officers from the Economic Crimes Division stepped onto the stage. They moved with the heavy, unhurried gait of men who knew the outcome was already decided. They didn't look at the crystal chandeliers or the abandoned plates of half-eaten and dessert. They looked only at the two people whose names were on the warrants in their pockets. "Victoria Thorne," the lead officer said. He was a man with a tired face and eyes that had seen too many rich people try to buy their way out of consequences. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement of charitable funds, and conspiracy to commit money laundering." Victoria stood by the podium. She looked like a wax figure that had been left too close to a fire. Her face was melting, her posture collapsing. She looked at the handcuffs hanging from the officer's belt, and for the first time in her life, she seemed to realize that the laws of physics and the state applied to her. "This is a mistake," she whispered. But the arrogance was gone. It was a plea, not a command. "I need to call my lawyer. I need Arthur Pym." "Mr. Pym is currently in custody." "Ma'am," the officer replied, his voice flat. "We picked him up at his office an hour ago. He is apparently very eager to discuss the creative accounting methods used by the Thorne Hope Foundation." That was the blow that broke her. Victoria let out a small, strangled sound, like a bird flying into a window. She held out her hands. The officer turned her around. Click, click. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the empty ballroom. It was a sharp, mechanical sound. It was the sound of a steel door slamming shut on 40 years of social climbing. But while Victoria accepted her fate with a catatonic shock, Julian did not. The security guard released him as the second officer approached. Julian scrambled to his feet, but he didn't run. He didn't fight. He looked at the officer, then he looked at his mother in handcuffs, and then his eyes locked on me. Panic, raw and ugly, flooded his face. He realized there was no trust fund to save him. There was no mother to protect him. There was only me. He threw himself at me. He didn't attack. He fell to his knees. He actually slid across the polished wood of the stage floor and wrapped his arms around my legs, burying his face in the red silk of my gown. "Serena, Serena, please," he sobbed, his voice high and shrill. "You have to stop them. Tell them it was a mistake. I didn't know, I swear to God. I didn't know." I looked down at him, the man I had married, the man I had once thought was a prince. He was sniveling, wiping his nose on my dress, clutching at me like a drowning man grabs a piece of driftwood. "Get up, Julian," I said. My voice was ice. "It was her," Julian screamed, pointing a shaking finger at his mother, who was being led down the stairs by the police. "It was all Victoria. She made me sign those papers. She told me it was tax optimization. I am a victim here. Serena, I am just like you. She used us both." Victoria stopped. She turned her head slowly to look at her son. Her eyes were dead. She didn't say a word. She just looked at the coward she had raised, the boy she had coddled and protected and corrupted, and saw him for exactly what he was. "I can fix this," Julian babbled, looking up at me with wide, wet eyes. "I will testify against her. I will tell them everything. We can start over. Baby, just you and me. We have the house now, right? You and I are in the house. We can go to Paris. I will be better, I promise." The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, with the police standing over him, he thought he could charm his way out. He thought he could leverage our marriage, the marriage he had planned to destroy an hour ago to save his own skin. I felt a wave of revulsion so strong it nearly made me nauseous. I reached down and peeled his fingers off my dress, one by one. I did it with the same distaste one would use to remove a leech. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice quiet but projecting clearly in the silent room. I took a step back, smoothing the fabric where he had grabbed it. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Julian," I said, looking down at him as if he were a stain on the floor. "And stop crying on my dress. This silk costs more than your integrity. In fact, at this exact moment, it costs more than your net worth." Julian froze. The cruelty of the truth slapped him across the face. "Officer," I said, nodding to the policeman, "please remove him. He is trespassing." The officer hauled Julian to his feet. Julian went limp, his legs dragging. his mouth opening and closing in silent protests as the handcuffs clicked onto his wrists. He finally stopped begging. He looked at me with pure hatred. "You planned this," he spat. "You planned this whole thing. You are a monster." "I am a crisis manager, Julian," I replied smoothly. "I managed the crisis. You were in a crisis." I watched them go. Victoria tried to walk with her head high, attempting to summon the ghost of her former dignity. She marched toward the double doors, her silver dress shimmering, her chin tilted up, but it was a hollow performance. The handcuffs pulled her shoulders forward. The police officer gripped her arm. She wasn't the queen of the Hamptons anymore. She was just another criminal in evening wear. Julian was dragged out behind her, weeping openly, a broken child in a man's tuxedo. The double doors swung shut behind them with a heavy thud. The room was suddenly very quiet. The storm outside seemed to have settled, or perhaps I just couldn't hear it over the pounding of my own heart, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of absolute victory. I looked around the ballroom. It was a wreckage of abandoned luxury. Napkins were thrown on the floor. Chairs were overturned. Half-drunk glasses of champagne sat on the tables, going flat. The event manager, a nervous woman named Sarah, who had been terrified of Victoria for years, approached the stage timidly. She was clutching her clipboard to her chest. "Mrs. Mrs. Graymont," she stammered. "What? What should we do?" "The band. The catering staff. Should I tell everyone to pack up?" I looked at the jazz quartet, who were sitting awkwardly in the corner, holding their instruments. I looked at the waiters standing by the kitchen doors, looking exhausted and confused. "Stop the music," I said. "I have had enough drama for one lifetime." Sarah nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. And the food, the lobsters, the cake. It is all going to waste." I looked at the buffet tables, laden with thousands of dollars of untouched seafood and delicacies. I thought about the hungry look I often saw in the eyes of the staff as they served plates they could never afford to buy. "No," I said. "Don't throw it away." I walked down the stairs of the stage. "Send the guests' cars away," I instructed. "But tell the staff, the waiters, the valets, the dishwashers, the musicians, and your team to come inside. Open the bar. Cut the cake. Let them eat." Sarah's eyes widened. "Ma'am." "You heard me," I said, unpinning the heavy diamond brooch from my dress, a gift from Julian's Gilthoffes, and tossing it onto a nearby table. "This was supposed to be a party. Just because the guests of honor are going to jail doesn't mean the lobster should spoil. Treat your team. Sarah, put it on my tab." A slow smile spread across Sarah's face. "Yes, Mrs. Graymont, thank you." I walked through the ballroom, the sound of my heels distinct on the parquet floor. I made my way to where Damon Vance was packing his briefcase. He looked up as I approached. He snapped the lock shut and straightened his tie. The charade was over. The lover was gone, replaced by the professional. "Clean sweep," Damon said, nodding toward the door. "The district attorney is very happy with the package you gave us. The evidence regarding the offshore accounts is airtight. They won't be seeing the outside of a cell for 10 to 15 years, minimum." "Good," I said. I didn't feel happy. I felt resolved. It was the feeling of closing a ledger where the numbers finally balanced. "And the house?" Damon asked, looking around the cavernous room. "It is a lot of space for one person." "It is," I agreed, "but I have plans for it. I am thinking of gutting the interior. The decor is too deceitful. I might turn it into a retreat center, or maybe I will just sell it to the highest bidder and burn the money. I haven't decided." Damon chuckled. He held out his hand. "It was a pleasure. Serena, you are terrifying. You know that." I took his hand. His grip was firm, dry, and respectful. There was no lingering touch, no romantic tension, just the acknowledgement of competence between two predators. "I take that as a compliment. Damon," I said, "send your invoice to my office on Monday, and add a 20% bonus for the acting performance. You were very convincing." "I'll try," he smiled. "Take care of yourself, Serena." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. leaving me alone in the center of the empire I had conquered. I didn't stay in the ballroom. The air was too stale. I needed to breathe. I walked through the French doors, stepping out onto the massive stone balcony that overlooked the ocean. The wind had died down to a brisk breeze, carrying the salt spray up from the beach below. The clouds were breaking, revealing a sliver of a cold, white moon. I walked to the stone railing and looked down. The driveway was a ribbon of asphalt winding through the manicured grounds. I could see the taillights of the police cruisers fading into the distance. Red pinpricks in the darkness. They were carrying away the last 5 years of my life. They were carrying away the lies, the gaslighting, the feeling of never being enough. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sharp, clean air. It tasted like freedom. I looked down at my left hand. The platinum band and the 3-carat solitaire diamond glittered in the moonlight. It was a beautiful ring. Julian had selected it with his mother. I remembered the day he put it on my finger. I remembered thinking it was a promise. Now, I saw it for what it was. It wasn't a promise. It was a shackle. It was a purchase order. It was a piece of metal that marked me as property. I reached out and picked up a glass of champagne that had been left on the balcony railing by a fleeing guest. The bubbles were still rising, tiny and persistent. Slowly, I worked the ring off my finger. It was tight, leaving a pale indentation on my skin where it had sat for 5 years. I held it up, looking at it one last time against the backdrop of the dark ocean. "I divorce thee," I whispered to the night. I dropped the ring into the champagne flute. It hit the bottom with a satisfying clink, sending a fizz of bubbles rushing to the surface. I didn't throw the glass into the ocean. That would be littering, and Serena Graymont does not litter. I left the glass on the stone railing, a tombstone for a dead marriage. I turned my back on the view. I turned my back on the police cars. I turned my back on the girl from Queens who had tried so hard to please people who hated her. I smoothed the red silk of my dress. I felt the cool stone beneath my feet. I walked back toward the open doors of the mansion. Inside, I could hear the faint sounds of the staff laughing. I could hear the clinking of plates as they began to eat the feast. Life was already filling the void. I walked into the light. The house was big. The house was empty. But for the first time since I had walked through these doors, the air was mine to breathe. The screen fades to black. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It was a long journey of revenge, justice, and claiming what is rightfully ours. I would love to know where you are listening from. Are you tuning in from the busy streets of New York, the quiet countryside of England, or somewhere else entirely? Please leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on Serena's plan. If you enjoyed seeing the Thorns get exactly what they deserved, please make sure to subscribe to Scarlet Revenge Stories, hit the like button, and smash that hype button to help this story reach more people. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, stay sharp.